October 14, 1943, 4:47 a.m., Białowieża Forest, occupied Poland. The forest had no mercy for men who did not know how to listen. Marek Sokolski knew this better than anyone alive. He lay flat against the cold ground, his cheek pressed to the wet moss, his breathing slow and controlled as the temperature dropped below freezing. Through the lattice of black pine branches above him, the stars were fading. Dawn was coming, and with it, a convoy that the German army believed no one in the forest knew about. But Marek knew. He had counted the tire tracks. He had read the boot prints at the edge of the logging road. He had found the discarded cigarette tin, German-made, still warm, and followed it back through the dark in his mind to its source. By the time the first bird called out in the pre-dawn silence, he had already built the entire picture inside his head. And 12 trucks, fuel and ammunition, moving west to east through the heart of Białowieża before noon, bound for the Wehrmacht supply depot at Hajnauka. If that convoy reached its destination, it would feed an operation that would kill hundreds, maybe thousands of men on the Eastern Front before winter closed the roads. Marek had one day, one man, and a forest that he had loved since he could walk. It would have to be enough. 5:20 a.m. He had not always been a ghost. Before the war, Marek Sokolski had been the head gamekeeper of Białowieża, the ancient royal forest that stretched across the border between Poland and the land the Germans now called the East. He had spent 35 years learning every tree, every trail, every hidden stream and boggy hollow in those 200,000 acres of wilderness. He had known which paths the bison used in spring. He had known where the wild boar sheltered from the winter storms. He had known how to walk through the forest without the deer lifting their heads. When the Germans came in 1939, they had taken the forest as their own private hunting ground. Senior officers came from Berlin and Warsaw to shoot elk and photograph themselves beside the dead animals. They had taken Marek's cottage, his equipment, his records of 30 years. They had taken his wife, Anna, and his son, Piotr, in the roundup of 1941 too, among thousands shipped east to camps from which no letters ever returned. They had not taken Marek. He had been in the forest when they came. He had been in the forest when they came. He had been watching a wolf den he had tracked for 3 weeks. When he returned to find the cottage empty and the village in ash, something inside him had gone very quiet. Not broken. Quiet. The way a bowstring goes quiet just before the arrow flies. He had not left the forest since. For 2 years he had lived inside it, sleeping in hollow trees and covered trenches, eating mushrooms and berries and what he could snare, watching the Germans move through what had once been his world. He learned their patterns as he had once learned the patterns of animals, their patrol schedules, their habits, their fears. The Germans feared the forest. They feared the dark between the trees, the sounds they could not identify, the sense that something older than their war was watching them. They never walked alone. They shouted too loudly and smoked too much. Marek had used this fear like a weapon from the very beginning, moving around German patrols the way water moves around stone, effortlessly, silently, leaving no sign. The intelligence about the convoy had come 2 days ago, not from a radio or a courier. It had come from the forest itself. He had been lying in the high branches of an oak at the edge of the main logging road when a German supply sergeant had stopped his motorcycle 50 meters below him and pulled out a map. The man had muttered to himself, a habit Marek had observed before in lonely soldiers, and in the still morning air every word had carried perfectly. 12 trucks, ammunition and fuel. October 14th, before noon. The sergeant had folded the map, kicked the motorcycle into life, and disappeared. Marek had climbed down from the oak and stood alone in the road for a long moment, his mind working. The convoy would follow the only road wide enough for trucks through this section of forest. A 4-kilometer stretch of packed gravel logging track that ran between 2 natural bottlenecks, one where the road dipped through a marshy lowland, and one where it curved sharply around a granite outcrop that the locals called the Wolf's Jaw. The trees pressed close on both sides. There was no alternate route that a truck could use. Marek had spent 2 days preparing. He had not slept more than 4 hours total. His hands were cut and blistered, his knees bruised from kneeling on frozen ground, and there was a deep ache in his lower back that had not left him since the previous winter. But the preparation was done. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light, he moved through the forest toward his first position, checking each element of his plan the way he had once checked his equipment before a long hunt. He did not think of it as war. He thought of it as a hunt. The prey had simply grown larger. 8:15 a.m. The first problem arrived with the sunrise. Merrick was crossing the southern edge of a logging road when he heard them. The snap of branches, the clink of equipment, the unmistakable rhythm of men who had not learned to walk quietly. He froze and dropped behind a fallen beech trunk, pressing himself into the wet leaves on the ground. A patrol, but not the regular one. He counted 8 men emerging from the tree line to the east, moving in a loose sweep formation that told him immediately these were not ordinary infantry doing their morning rounds. These men were spread too wide, watching the tree line too carefully. One of them was bent low, examining the ground. They had a tracker. Merrick felt the cold settle deeper in his chest. German patrols rarely used trackers in WWII. The forest was considered too dense and too large to track anyone effectively, a belief that Marek had spent 2 years carefully encouraging. But someone, somewhere, had decided to change the rules today. He studied the tracker from his position, a heavy-set man in a gray-green jacket who moved differently from the soldiers around him. He was civilian, Polish, possibly, a man who knew forests. Merrick watched him crouch and touch the ground near the edge of the road and felt a cold twist of professional recognition. The man was good. He would find the boot prints Marek had left near the second bottleneck if the patrol continued on that heading. The patrol would reach that point in 40 minutes. Marek had a choice. He could abandon the second trap entirely, the one that was, in many ways, the most important, or he could redirect the patrol. He thought for 3 seconds, then he chose. He reached into the pack on his back and took out a short length of cord tied to a small brass bell, a shepherd's bell he had taken from an abandoned farm months ago. He tied the cord to a low branch, adjusted the tension carefully so the next strong gust of wind would set it ringing, and retreated 50 meters north into the dense undergrowth. Then he found a dry stick and snapped it. The sound cracked through the morning air like a pistol shot. The patrol stopped instantly. The tracker stood upright. Every head turned north, away from the second bottleneck, away from Marek's prepared position. Then the wind moved, and the bell rang. Marek was already gone, circling back south through the trees at a speed that would have astonished anyone who saw it, moving without sound over the frozen ground, placing each foot with the care of a man crossing thin ice. He reached the second bottleneck in 22 minutes, checked the preparations he had made, found them undisturbed, and made the final adjustments he had been planning to make at dawn. He looked back through the trees in the direction of the patrol. The bell was still ringing on its cord, guiding 8 men and 1 very good tracker north into 2 kilometers of dense, featureless forest that contained absolutely nothing. He allowed himself a single, quiet breath of relief. The second problem arrived 40 minutes later, and it was worse. He was at his primary observation point, a natural hollow between 2 granite boulders that gave him a clear line of sight along 300 meters of road, when he heard the sound he had not expected. Not trucks, not boots. An engine, yes, but the wrong kind. A German staff car came around the eastern curve of the logging road, moving slowly through the ruts, its windshield catching the pale October light. It stopped 50 meters from his position. 3 men got out. 2 were officers, 1 a colonel from the insignia, and 1 a man in the dark uniform of the Gestapo. The third was a driver, who immediately lit a cigarette and leaned against the front wheel. The 2 officers walked to the edge of the road and spoke quietly. The Gestapo man held a leather briefcase close against his side with the tightness of a man who never let go of it. Merrick lay in his hollow and processed what this meant. The convoy was not simply moving ammunition. There was someone important riding with it, someone who warranted a personal advance car, an officer checking the route before the trucks followed, which meant the convoy was closer than he had thought. An hour, perhaps less. The presence of the Gestapo officer changed the calculation in another way. That briefcase meant intelligence, documents, possibly, or something equally valuable. 2 years alone in the forest had stripped Marek down to the most essential thinking, and the most essential thought he had now was simple. Whatever was in that briefcase mattered more than the ammunition, but he was one man, and one man could not do everything. He waited, still as stone, while the officers conferred. After 11 minutes, they returned to the car. The driver dropped his cigarette. The car reversed down the road and turned east. The convoy was coming. Merrick climbed out of his hollow and began to move. 10:08 a.m. He had spent 35 years reading the forest language, and the forest had never lied to him. The first bottleneck was a natural depression where the road dropped 2 meters into a narrow corridor between stands of ancient hornbeam. The ground on either side was boggy, frozen on the surface but soft enough beneath the crust to swallow a man to the knee. Matic had widened the soft ground strategically over 2 nights, carefully cutting through the frozen crust along the road's edge and leaving the cuts hidden under a thin layer of pine needles. The visual effect was perfect. The road looked solid from 30 meters. From 3 meters, it still looked solid. From 0 meters, it was not. He had done something else along this corridor. Working before dawn over the previous 2 mornings, he had located a colony of wood ants, a massive nest built into a rotting oak stump that stood 10 meters from the road. He had carefully packed the nest's primary ventilation shafts with dried grass, sealing the colony inside. The ants were cold now, dormant, but not dead, compressed into a seething mass beneath the bark. He had used a similar technique for the hornet's nest he had found in a hollow tree farther along the corridor, sealed with a wet clay plug that would dissolve rapidly when disturbed. These were not weapons of killing. They were weapons of chaos, of confusion, of fear. A German soldier encountering a cloud of angry hornets in a narrow road, unable to retreat because trucks were behind him and bog was on either side, would stop thinking tactically. He would stop being a soldier for approximately 60 seconds and become simply a man in pain and panic. 60 seconds was all Merrick needed. The second bottleneck, the wolf's jaw, the granite curve, was where the main action would happen. Here, 2 months ago, Marek had begun his longest and most patient preparation. Working alone, moving only in darkness, he had used a combination of hand tools and his own physical strength to weaken the base of a large dead spruce that leaned over the road at the tightest point of the curve. The tree was old, its heartwood soft with rot, and it needed only encouragement to fall. He had cut 3/4 of the way through its base in a series of sessions, spread over 6 weeks, covering the cuts with bark and leaf litter each time. The spruce now stood on a fraction of its original structural wood, held in place by 2 rope tensions, one attached to a neighboring pine that had kept it upright through the autumn winds, and one that he could release from a distance with a single pull. But a fallen tree across a road was only an inconvenience if the trucks could simply reverse and find another way. Merrick had ensured that reversing would not be simple. The secondary preparation was subtler. Along the eastern approach to the Wolf's Jaw, where the trucks would be driving, he had spent the previous night removing the gravel surfacing from a 20-meter section of road and replacing it with a carefully arranged layer of loose stones over deep mud. A section that looked identical to the rest of the road, but would mire a heavy truck to its axles within seconds of the wheels breaking through the thin stone cover. He attested the consistency of the mud personally, lying in it in the dark, measuring its depth with his arm. It was deep enough. The sound of the convoy reached him at 10:17. He was in the trees 40 meters north of the first bottleneck, lying on a low branch that gave him elevation over the road. He heard the growl of diesel engines first, then the clatter of chains, then the creak of heavy frames on rough road. He counted the engine sounds as they grew. 8, 10, 12. 12. All trucks toxed. They were running close together, perhaps 50 meters between each vehicle, which was tighter than standard. Someone was nervous about the road and had ordered the convoy to bunch up to maintain visual contact. That was a mistake. Merrick had been counting on standard spacing, but tighter was better. The lead truck entered the first bottleneck corridor. He pulled the first cord. It was a simple mechanism, fishing line, strong enough for 40 kilos, running through 3 wooden guide rings he had nailed into trees over the previous 2 days. The cord ran to the sealed ant nest. It pulled the plug. The dried grass came out. The second cord ran to the hornet's nest. He pulled that one 18 seconds later. The lead truck had slowed in the corridor, the driver feeling something was slightly wrong with the road surface, the instinct of an experienced man. He had stopped the truck with its front wheels on the edge of the soft ground. That was exactly where Merrick needed it. The hornets came out in a cloud. It took approximately 4 seconds for the first soldiers in the convoy to understand what was happening to them. Merrick did not watch them. He was already moving, crossing the road 20 meters behind the last truck in the column, his footsteps silent on the frozen gravel, heading for the Wolf's Jaw at a run. He could hear the shouting behind him, the sound of men in pain and confusion. Doors opening, commands being given and ignored. The convoy had stopped. Every truck in the line had halted. He reached the wolf's jaw in 90 seconds. He was breathing hard, harder than he would have liked, but his hands were steady as he took hold of the main release rope. He looked up at the dead spruce towering above the curve in the road. In the thin October light, its bare branches were skeletal against the pale sky. He thought of Anna. He thought of Piotr. He pulled the rope. The sound of the tree falling was something Merrick felt in his chest before he heard it. A deep, grinding crack as the last fibers of heartwood gave way, followed by the long, accelerating crash of 40 years of growth coming down across the road. The trunk hit the gravel with a force that shook the ground under his feet and sent a cloud of dead bark and dust rising into the cold air. The road was blocked. He was already at the secondary position, the mired section, when he heard the first truck try to reverse. He could tell from the engine sound that the driver had found reverse, had accelerated, had confidence. Then the engine note changed. He heard the wheels spinning. He heard the driver accelerate harder, the familiar, desperate sound of a man who cannot believe what is happening. The truck was sinking. He had planned for this moment carefully. A mired truck in the middle of a column meant the trucks behind it could not reverse freely. They would have to back up one at a time, threading through a road that was barely wide enough, while the forest pressed close on either side and the confusion at the front of the column continued. But there was something he had not fully planned for. The Gestapo officer's staff car had apparently followed close behind the convoy. Merrick heard it, the lighter engine sound, the crack of its wheels on the gravel, and he understood in an instant that the officer had decided to ride with the convoy rather than precede it. The car must have been somewhere in the middle of the column. He lay still in the undergrowth and thought. The car was lighter than the trucks. It could potentially reverse faster. If the Gestapo officer assessed the situation quickly and understood that the convoy was disabled, he would try to extract himself and his briefcase. The road behind the convoy was clear for perhaps 300 meters, far enough for the car to turn around on the wide section near the eastern edge of the forest. Merrick had nothing prepared for that scenario. He had, however, spent 2 years in WWII. He ran south, parallel to the road, using a deer trail he knew in the dark. He reached the wide section near the eastern edge in 4 minutes and stopped at the tree line, breathing through his nose, listening. The convoy sounds were distant and confused. Engines revving, men shouting in German, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the middle of it all. No shots. That was good. No one had seen him yet. He heard the staff car before he saw it. It came around a curve in the road at speed, bouncing over the ruts, the driver clearly under urgent orders. The car skidded slightly on the loose gravel as it reached the wide section and stopped. The driver had seen the problem. A massive beech tree lay across the road at the eastern edge, not the one Merrick had cut. This one had fallen in the previous week's storm, and he had simply not cleared it from this end of the road. The forest had done it for him. The car could not pass. The driver got out and walked to the tree, assessing. The Gestapo officer stepped out of the back seat. He stood in the middle of the road with his briefcase, looked at the fallen tree, looked back toward the convoy, and made a decision. He said something to the driver. The driver began looking for an alternative, walking into the trees, searching for a gap the car could use. Marek was already behind them. He moved through the undergrowth with the patience of a man who had tracked wild boar through worse terrain in winter. He crossed the road silently on the far side of the tree, circled, and came at the briefcase from a direction the officer had not considered, because the officer had not considered that anything in the forest was a threat. What happened in the next 40 seconds was quiet, methodical, professional. Merrick incapacitated the driver from behind using a technique an older partisan had showed him 2 years ago, lowering the man to the ground without sound. The Gestapo officer heard something, turned, and found a face emerging from the trees. Weathered and dark, with gray-green eyes that held an expression the officer had never seen on a human face before. Not hatred, not anger, something older, colder. Marek took the briefcase. He left the officer and the driver alive. They were no threat to him now, and there was no one in the forest to hand them to except the wolves. He took the briefcase and ran. 2:30 p.m., darkness coming early. The Germans began searching at 2:30 when it became clear to whatever officer was commanding the ruined convoy that a single individual had somehow stopped 12 trucks in the heart of the WWII forest and disappeared. Merrick heard the search parties long before they came near him. He had gone deep northeast, through the bison corridor, into the oldest part of the forest where the trees were 400 years old and so dense overhead that even the October afternoon felt like dusk. He was moving well, despite the ache in his back and the cut on his left palm where the release rope had burned through on the way down. The briefcase was awkward to carry through undergrowth. It kept catching on low branches. So he had unlatched it and transferred the documents inside to his own pack, flattening them carefully against the back panel. He did not stop to read them. That was not his job. His job was to get them to the Armia Krajowa courier, who appeared at a certain hollow oak every Thursday evening at dusk. Thursday was today. Dusk was 4 hours away. The forest helped him. This was the part of his story that no German officer commanding a search that afternoon would ever have understood, because it required accepting something they had not been trained to accept, that a man who had spent 35 years in a forest and then 2 years surviving inside it did not merely use the forest. He moved with it. He knew which birds would call alarm when men approached. He knew which deer would break cover and run in the direction he needed to avoid. He knew from the sound of the wind and different densities of trees whether he was moving into open ground or thicker cover. He had spent 2 years reading those signals every hour of every day because his life had depended on it. Now they told him where the search parties were. At 3:15, a blackbird in the northwest raised the sharp alarm call that meant something large and upright was moving. Marek altered course east. At 4:05, a pair of ravens moved with unusual speed from the northeast toward the south, following something curious, which told him a patrol had entered the bison corridor behind him. He went north, into terrain so boggy and reed-choked that even the bison rarely used it in late autumn. He crossed the bog on a route he had scouted in summer, a series of grassy tussocks just below the frozen surface, each one barely large enough to stand on, the gaps between them concealed by a skin of ice that would not hold a man's weight, but held his perfectly when he moved quickly and placed his feet correctly. On the far side, he scraped the black mud from his boots with a stick and kept moving. At 5 o'clock, the light went out of the sky in the way it does in October. Not gradually, but in a long, slow collapse, the gray deepening through blue to black. Marek stopped in the shadows of a massive ancient oak and listened to the forest change around him. The daybirds fell silent. The nightbirds were not yet awake. There was a 10-minute window of near-perfect quiet during which the only sounds were the wind in the high canopy and the distant, directionless echo of German search parties stumbling through darkness with torches. They were far away now, moving away from him. He breathed slowly and rested his back against the oak. Above him, the first stars were appearing between the branches. The temperature was falling sharply, close to freezing now and dropping. He reached into his pack and pulled out the thin wool blanket he always carried, wrapping it around his shoulders, and ate 2 pieces of hard bread from the pocket of his coat. He thought about the documents in his pack. He did not know what they said, but he had seen enough in 2 years to understand that intelligence gathered in a forest in Poland could move by courier to London and back to the Eastern Front in ways that saved lives he would never know about. He thought about this the way a gamekeeper thinks about planting a tree, not for himself, but for something that would outlast him. He checked the time by the stars. He had 1 hour to reach the hollow oak. He stood up, adjusted the pack on his shoulders, and moved back into the darkness. October 15th, 1943, 6:12 a.m. Marek sat in the roots of a river willow and watched the dawn come. The courier had been at the hollow oak, a young woman, younger than he expected, perhaps 19 or 20, who received the documents without a word, wrapped them inside an oilskin packet with the practiced speed of someone who had done it many times, and disappeared south through the trees like a ghost. She had not told him where she was going. He had not asked. That was how it worked. The river in front of him was the Nariuka, a small, dark river that moved silently through the southern edge of WWII, carrying the cold of the forest with it. In summer, it was green and clear. In October, it was black and quiet, reflecting the pale sky above the trees. Marek had played here as a child, 50 meters downstream, in a pool that his father had shown him. His father had been a gamekeeper, too. It ran in the family, the particular kind of love for a place that grows from knowing it completely, every season, every mood, every season. He did not think about whether the convoy operation had been a success in any strategic sense. He had no way to know that. And the part of him that had been a careful man before the war understood that single operations in single forests did not win wars. But 12 trucks of ammunition and fuel had not reached Hajnauka. They were still on the logging road, mired and blocked, surrounded by a forest that had closed around them. The documents were moving toward people who could read them and act on them. That was enough. He thought about what he had taken from the forest over 35 years, the stillness it had taught him, the patience, the understanding that the greatest power in any natural system was not force, but knowledge, knowing where to be, when to be there, how to use what the landscape gave you rather than fighting against it. He had applied everything the forest had ever taught him against the men who had taken it from him. He wondered if his father would have understood. He thought that he would. He did not think about Anna and Pyotr for long. It hurt too much, and there was still another day ahead that would require him to be sharp and cold and clear. He saved that grief for later, for the hollow moments of deep night when there was nothing else to do but sit with it. He was good at sitting with it. The forest had taught him that too, that some things must simply be carried, the way the river carries silt, without the option of putting it down. A crow landed in the branches above him and watched him with flat, curious eyes. Emmerich watched it back. In Hajnauka, 12 kilometers to the east, a German logistics officer was writing a report that would describe, in precise bureaucratic language, the disabling of an entire supply convoy in the WWII forest by what the report would term person or persons unknown, employing unorthodox methods. The officer would note the loss of the vehicle carrying a certain Gestapo intelligence officer and the loss of the documents that officer had been transporting. You would recommend an expanded search operation and increased forest patrols. The expanded search operation would not find Marek Sokolsky. They had been trying to find him for 2 years. By the time the crow lost interest and flew away into the pale morning sky, Marek had already risen from the willow roots and moved back into the trees. He had work to do. There were trails to check, positions to prepare, signs to read. The forest was still his, and the forest always won.